Welcome back to another captivating episode of Elisha's Space. We have invited Dr. Brie-Anna Willey to shed light on a topic that affects many in the helping professions, compassion fatigue. Join us as we discuss strategies to prevent burnout and prioritize self-care. This episode is a must-listen for anyone in the helping professions or those interested in understanding the toll that caring for others can take on our well-being.
Hello, Elisha Space audience. I am so thankful that you are here to join us today. It is an exciting time of the year. I don't know about you, but we're still in the process, at least our family is, and getting our decorations done. We still have the tree up, and so we're like, okay, we got to get the decorations down from the tree, and just enjoying the transition of getting back from the holidays and everything. And I would like to welcome my new guest. Her name is Dr. Brie-Anna Willey. She has obtained her doctorates of education from Liberty University in community care and counseling with a focus on trauma. And she wrote a dissertation where she spoke about understanding the experiences of compassion fatigue among counselors in private practice, a phenomenal approach. And she finished this just last year in 2023. So I asked her on the show, not just because of her experience with working with counselors in that topic area of compassion fatigue, but also because any role of a caregiver, whether you're taking care of a loved one, you are a parent taking care of your children, and maybe you're in a field of coaching or the medical field where you're doing some sort of care, where you have to show compassion within that. Even in interview situations, like maybe you have a role where you have to do interviews and you have to be empathetic and you have to show a vulnerable side of yourself. You have to allow yourself to open up in order to show compassion towards another individual. And it's almost as if you're giving away an essence of yourself. It's almost as if you're making yourself vulnerable in those situations to a degree. Now, in our respective fields, we're given training on how to compartmentalize some of these things. But even within that training of compartmentalization, we are still human. We wanted to touch on this and talk about it a little bit because it can be tiring. And a lot of times when you get to a state of fatigue, it leaves you at a place where it can affect your mood. It can affect you, especially around depression and anxiety, because it's like you're carrying some things that you shouldn't carry. So I asked her to come on the show so that we could talk a little bit about this topic because I think it's very important. We don't want to come off as not being caring individuals, but at the same time, we do want to be individuals that are also looking out for our health. We're looking out for our care for ourselves. There is a scripture, it's in reference to when Jesus gives the commandments in the New Testament. And he gave two commandments. One, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then the second commandment is this, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So within that area of compassion fatigue, if you're not taking care of yourself, it's very difficult to show love and care and compassion to others around you if you are in a state of tired. So I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show. As you can see, Dr. Willey, I am very interested in, and I'm passionate about this because I think it's an easy thing to fall into, while at the same time, not necessarily spoken about like it should be. Could you provide us with a definition of what compassion fatigue is? And how does
Yes.
it impact other people? The person who's the counselor, the therapist, and others who are in those types of compassion fields as well.
Yeah. And thank you for having me on the show. I am honored. And we're talking about my heart too, compassion fatigue. My heart goes out to people who struggle because of giving to others,
Mm.
to comfort them, to build them up, to build up their strength so they can continue to stay in the field and continue to help. So, going back to what is compassion fatigue, when I was looking into the research that exists, there was some overlap with the definitions, and I was getting a little confused because of that overlap. But I and my dissertation chair looked at some of the different definitions and combined them to come up with, based on Stebnicki 2017, compassion fatigue is empathy fatigue that
Mm.
negatively impacts the mind, body, and spiritual self. And I like that definition because it's talking about the whole self is impacted.
Yes.
And then Stam 2010, who created the professional quality of life scale, she talked about it having two parts, which includes burnout and secondary traumatic stress.
Whoa.
And burnout is where counselors or helpers have a feeling of hopelessness, maybe exhaustion, a lack of effectiveness in their work. Secondary traumatic stress is where counselors have secondary exposure to trauma that their clients may have experienced. So that's what we wrote up based on the research as what we think is compassion fatigue.
And I would even say too, around that is it explains why some people get exhausted. Even people that serve in religious settings, whether it be a church
Mhm.
or a synagogue or just any area where you're pouring out. And I
Mhm.
remember times when working with people and even people in my personal lives when they would be in those types of roles. And after they were done, they would crash and they would sleep for hours just because they were so tired from that.
We need
Mhm.
breaks. We need rest. We need self care, all of those things. It's very important.
And what would you say are some common signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue? And how does it differentiate from burnout? I know that's a whopper of a question, but
Yeah. So Stam was talking about, who created the ProQual, that compassion fatigue is at the top, basically. And I agree with this definition. And then as a prong is burnout, and then secondary traumatic stress. So
mhm,
it's more like burnout is part of compassion fatigue under her theory.
mhm,
And I really think that explains that pretty well. And then the trauma pieces, like we're hearing from our clients a lot of upsetting things.
yes,
And that can be a form of trauma for us. Burnout is maybe a part of compassion fatigue. And the symptoms, again, of burnout are, I think it's unique for each person, but I think it was Maslow talked about, one of the researchers, it's hopelessness, exhaustion, a lack of effectiveness, feeling like my work isn't good enough.
mm,
I'm not working hard enough, maybe some perfectionism. And actually, with secondary traumatic stress, too, we may experience trauma symptoms. We may have flashbacks, nightmares, things like that.
absolutely. And I was just thinking about how this can affect teachers as well. And within, I believe it's nursing and teaching, there's a lot to this too. And I don't want to get down,
Yes,
but there's a lot of turnover
they're
because
giving.
yeah, because it's so much. And I
Hmm.
often wonder if, at times, I wonder if they were given proper support around compassion fatigue, especially like how we have to go and get our CEOs and things of that nature. If there was more training around these areas, if it would be as high of a turnover, saying
Yes,
like
right?
implementing more things to try to protect their
Yes.
staff. Now, there's a lot of variables around that, but in the area of compassion fatigue, I just think it's so important to recognize that it's a different type of thing because you're giving away an essence of yourself.
I like that.
What makes you who you are.
Yeah, and we enjoy giving
Mhm.
and listening and supporting, We enjoy that, but yes, it takes a lot of work to be present with our clients and really hear them. So we need to rest afterwards, set up good boundaries, emotional boundaries to protect our minds and our spirits and recharge.
What would you say are some specific strategies or techniques that people can do?
That's a really good question. And I'll use myself as an example. When I noticed I was getting stressed and noticed, especially around 2020, where a lot was being thrown at us counselors and switching to online work
Mhm,
and just
mhm,
all the things. I had to set some boundaries. They're just I was getting calls all the time. I didn't know that I needed to set work hours. I had to set some time management boundaries.
mhm.
I had to hire a virtual assistant to help me manage all the things, which actually freed me up for providing counseling. I did go completely online and I found that helps my work life balance.
I might need to get your reference for some virtual assistants for myself, but go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think they'd mind me saying, but MH Link, they're really good. But yeah, virtual assistants, I think they're really important. And let's see, delegating if we can. And I
Mhm.
get there's money involved with delegating, but it's freeing up your time. It's invaluable, your time.
So I know for myself last year, audience, I know we're talking more on the counselor side, and we'll get to the general area around other professions too. But if you have a business, there's also resources you can probably get from your local city, county, or state. I know for my practice, I was able to get a intern to help me, and there was this program where they paid for my staff's pay. So,
Ooh.
right. So if you look around, there are programs, there's grants that can assist you so that you're not feeling like you have to do everything, because I also think there's a heaviness around feeling like everything is on your shoulders. And something we didn't discuss either, that we didn't bring up, was a lot of times when you get into these roles, you know, you just got some disturbing news about a family member. Maybe you had an argument or something like that with your spouse, or you woke up and you stubbed your toe and it hurts. But
Mhm.
still, you have to show up for that person. And that
Right.
takes energy too. You know,
Yes.
you have to compartmentalize and leave that at the door and do a division between the two so that
Right.
you can show up. And if you're not taking steps like what you had mentioned regarding self love and taking care of yourself, then it can easily blur the lines and you won't be as effective with helping that person because you're not all there. They could be at a
Mhm.
critical state and you could miss some things because you're not all there. So, protecting yourself around compassion fatigue is so
Yep.
important. I would
Yes.
also say, too, and I talk about this quite often, is making sure that you give yourself breaks,
Mhm.
schedule breaks for yourself. Even if it's sometimes, I know for myself, if I have a heavy day, I'll get up and I'll go outside and maybe just do a walk around the block or walk around the area just so
Yeah.
that I can get some sun, just to rejuvenate myself from whatever is there. And I'll also add this, it doesn't hurt, because we talk about faith as well as mental health. So I don't think there's anything wrong with taking some time out and to just take a moment and just pray and say within those prayers, or meditate, and just making sure that you're giving yourself some care and love during that time. Maybe it's something heavy that was said, and you just want to do a cleansing and pray around that. Because I do believe sometimes that things can transfer meaning and unmeaning too. I think that's important as well. What would you say to that? Do it sound like I'm on the right track with you?
I think so. Going back to self care, taking a walk, asking for help. That was
Mm,
one of the themes when I did my research with my participants. They weren't sure what self care was. That needs to be defined. Reaching out for help is very important for to other counselors, other consultants, coaches, just people who can help and listen and be
mhm.
there. Yes, taking a walk. getting some other surroundings, the grounding techniques with that, the
Right.
mindfulness with that. We have to use those too. We teach them, but we have to use them. And easier said than done.
Sometimes we can be our own worst patients, right?
Hmm. Yeah. But yes, asking for help through prayer, the spiritual side of it. One of my favorite scriptures is Psalm 55:22. I cast this burden on the Lord, releasing the weight of it, and he will sustain me. And I think that's like a form of containment.
Mm,
We're
I love that
giving
scripture.
God,
Hmm.
yeah, we're given that the traumas we've heard, we don't have to carry them alone. And I had another participant that said something like that too. It was so neat. I would hear similar themes of strategies
Hmm.
that some of us use and others we can share and learn from each other. That's why networking, another thing, is so important. We're not just talking about our services, we're learning from each other.
Right. Connection is so important, especially when you're in a role where you're doing caregiving, especially if it's also for a loved one, because that can be so isolating. So, connection is so important. Taking time out to, yes, doing the networking, but also, calling a friend up. You don't have to tell them what you're dealing with. A lot of times we can't do that anyway. We really
Right.
can't do that anyway. But just having that distraction, finding a distractor
Yes.
can help as well to help get you, as you use the word, back to being more centered and grounded. And also to staying true to your why, remembering your why. I often keep things around me to remind me of my why, to
Mhm,
protect myself from getting caught up. And I'm not always perfect with it, audience. I mean, I'm just keeping it real. But
mhm.
doing my best to remember, why am I doing this? What's the importance of what I'm doing?
Yes.
And what a gift it is, because no matter what you may be doing, audience, whether it be counseling, therapy, maybe you're in the medical field, maybe you're in some form of a ministry where you're serving and helping others, even like a first responder, a police officer, maybe has to show care in certain types of situations and circumstances. No matter what, it is such a gift to be able to pour into someone to help them have a better life, to have a better experience, to get some healing and wholeness. I think that's such a gift, but we have to take those necessary measures in order to protect ourselves as well.
Yes, I agree.
You spoke briefly about boundaries and how important boundaries are. Can you give some practical tips or guidelines that can be followed to establish and maintain healthy boundaries?
Yes, I can try. I do think they're unique to each helper, our boundaries. So we need to first figure out what are our boundaries. Like, when do we feel we most effectively provide that service or counseling?
Hmm.
I've noticed my work hours are best between 10 and ending at 5. And I may move that around too, depending on my energy levels,
Hmm.
but I'm doing my best work in that time. So I try to do that. And I set business hours. Like I said, I think that's very important. Yes, we want to have referrals and be there for clients in crisis, but we need to also protect ourselves. So there needs to be a balance.
Hmm.
So, thinking of us too, we have to recharge to continue to pour out. So, time boundaries, business hours with that, financial boundaries. Do you have a policy for late cancellations? Things like that. What else? Delegating is part of boundaries, emotional boundaries. Like I was talking about the scripture of containment with Psalm 55:22. We take so much on us, we need to learn how to manage that. And it's difficult to describe how to do that, but it's an emotional boundary. It's like containment. We need to put it back in a box at some point. So we're not thinking about it all the time, but we're thinking about it when we need to, when we're helping, but that we're able to live our lives and be ourselves during the other times. I think being oneself is so important. What
Hmm.
do you enjoy as a helper? What recharges you? So, setting boundaries around that thing. Do you love tennis? Okay, try to fit that into your schedule somewhere. Maybe that kind of thing. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great answer. And I would even add, even if it's in a more general way, as far as covering people that are caring for other loved ones on the personal side of things, there's nothing wrong with asking other family members to help you or looking into another agency that can assist you. So
Yeah,
there's
that delegating,
yes, it's part of
sharing
the
it.
whole delegating. So even
Mhm.
though you were giving it specific to our profession, which is great, audience, you can glean some of these things and say, okay, how can I take some of the things that were mentioned and apply them to my situation? Particularly like with the emotional boundaries and things of that nature. There's
Mhm.
things that you can do around yourself to protect yourself. Like, for example, if it's a loved one who needs constant care and a family member needs to be at the home, maybe you can work something out where you can go on certain times of the week and that other person can go certain times of the week. You can have your own break and establish your own boundaries around that. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, so you have time for self-care.
absolutely. What advice would you give to caregivers who may be currently struggling with compassion fatigue or are concerned about its potential impact?
Yes, and I know I keep going back to boundaries, but like you were saying, can you share the load in some way, or can you set different hours,
Right.
find time to recharge? What does that look like? Again, I think self-care is unique to each person, so self-care for me may be completely different than your self-care,
Hmm.
but setting that time around that thing or those things is very important. So, self care, boundary around it. And I get that in my research, a participant was saying, I think I said, what is self care? People keep telling us do more self care to help with compassion fatigue. And I think, again, it's unique. We got to figure out what recharges us. Again, if someone's just saying, oh, do more self care, we need more than that. What in particular is recharging is very, I think, important.
So here's an example of that. If taking out some time in your day just to be alone and just take some time to read a book or listen to some music that you enjoy, catching up on a show, if that's something that brings you joy, not happiness, but joy, if it's
Yeah.
something that gives you energy to keep moving, that is an example of self care.
Mhm.
Also, right before we did our interview, you spoke on self compassion, like showing yourself compassion. And I know a lot
Mhm.
of times when we're working with our clientele, we often talk about having compassion, but can you talk on that as well? Because I think that also affects our compassion fatigue as well.
Yes, you're right. It does impact us. So, our own inner voice, what are we saying to ourselves? And trying to change that to be more kind, that I'm allowed to have business hours. That's okay.
Hmm.
It's okay to protect my time. Yes, we want to have balance with that so we're not too far the other way, but it's not being selfish to fill ourselves back up. We have to do that to continue to give. So it's okay to say to ourselves, it's okay to take time for me.
Hmm.
It's okay that I'm not perfect. I'm doing my best. And yes, we continue to learn and grow in our field or what we're working on, but we don't have to be perfect. So taking that heaviness off, you were talking about heaviness earlier. That was another kind of trigger or precursor to compassion fatigue is the weight of the world, the stressors around us, the things we're going through in our homes or at work or whatever it is, that adds up. And then if we're also caregiving or giving in our work, that can get overwhelming. So setting aside time for yourself and being kind about setting aside
Hmm.
that time. It's okay I set this time. It's okay that I watch a TV show I love. It's okay if I play a video game for a half hour or whatnot. Have my favorite food. It's okay.
Dr. Wiley, I want to thank you for coming onto the show and bringing in this information. I think it's so valuable, it's so needed because I personally don't think it's talked about enough. And I also
Mhm.
that more needs to be done regarding resources to support those in these types of roles and professions because it is unique. And it's not like we're going and we're just doing something that's a textbook thing. Yes, thank God we're using our education, but at the same time, we're also giving an essence of ourselves. We're sharing, we're making ourselves open and vulnerable when we show compassion and care to another individual.
Yes.
So I want to thank you for coming onto the show. If someone wants to contact you, maybe they want counseling services, therapy, or greater education, how can they reach out to you? And do you have any upcoming projects?
Yes. And thank you so much for having me on the show. They can go to my website. So I provide coaching for private practice or for other therapists or helpers. So they can go to my website, www.attainablevision.biz, and then there's contact forms on there. If they are looking for counseling and they're in Florida, because I can only counsel in Florida, they can visit my website, shekinacounseling.com. And also there's contact forms on there too.
I love the name of that, Shekinah Counseling. That's cool.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So, audience, I hope this podcast episode was something that will assist and support you within your healing journey. My hope, my prayer is that you'll just take a little slice, a little snippet of information, and it will be meaningful for you and that it will assist and support you in your healing journey. Be well, and we will see you and talk to you again.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. Now go, move forward in your healing journey.